The Japanese anticipated that the upcoming naval battle would be a decisive one. However, it had been 2 years since their aircraft carriers and battleships had ventured out to challenge the United States Navy. Many of the skilled aviators and aircraft carriers that had launched devastating attacks in the early battles, including Pearl Harbor, were now at the bottom of the ocean. Their replacements were newly built warships with inexperienced crews and airmen. Adding to their troubles, Japan's navy and economy were severely strained due to the American submarine campaign, which had cut off vital oil supplies. Despite these challenges, Admiral Sumu Toyoda, the commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, remained determined. By June 1944, Japan's situation had worsened. British forces had lifted the sieges of Imphal and Kohima. The Chinese front remained a deadlock, and the Americans were now preparing a major assault on the Mariana Islands. The attack force included 15 aircraft carriers, 7 modern battleships, and 3 marine divisions. Japanese naval strategy since the 1930s had predicted that the decisive battle against the United States would take place in this region. However, initial plans that focused on battleship engagements had become obsolete due to the dominance of aircraft carriers and submarines. A new strategy was required, and Toyota decided to deploy the Imperial Navy's strongest fleet, known as the First Mobile Fleet, under Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa. To address the fuel shortages, the Japanese assembled their fleet at Tawi-Tai anchorage near the Borneo oil fields. However, American submarines closely monitored their movements and reported their positions. This intelligence alerted the U.S. Pacific Fleet, but did not stop Vice Admiral Raymond Spruance, who commanded the U.S. Fifth Fleet, from proceeding with the invasion of the Mariana Islands. As the battle approached, the Americans launched heavy air and naval bombardments on the island of Saipan before sending Marines ashore on June 15. Aware of the invasion, Ozawa led his fleet to sea on June 11. His forces included some of Japan's most powerful warships, such as the massive battleships Yamato and Musashi, which carried 18-inch guns, the fleet carriers Shokaku and Zukaku, which had played a key role in the Pearl Harbor attack, were also part of the fleet, along with several light carriers and the newly designed carrier Taiho. This ship incorporated lessons from previous battles, especially improvements in damage control. However, just as Ozawa's fleet began moving, the American submarine U.S. Flying Fish spotted and reported their movements. Spruance began preparing for battle. Unlike at Midway, the Americans held significant advantages. Their forces included 15 carriers compared to Japan's 9, 7 battleships to Japan's 5, and 21 cruisers against Japan's 13. Most importantly, the Americans had 891 aircraft on their carriers, while the Japanese fleet carried only 430. Ozawa's only potential advantage was an additional 400 land-based planes stationed on islands like Iwo Jima and Saipan. Despite Japan's fuel shortages, lack of training, and outdated equipment, Ozawa's fleet was still the most powerful naval force Japan had ever assembled. It was 50% larger than the fleet that had attacked Pearl Harbor. Many of Japan's officers and pilots were confident in their chances, believing their aircraft would devastate the American fleet. Admiral Matono Ugaki, who commanded the battleships, even wrote in his diary that failure was unthinkable. Meanwhile, American naval aviators considered themselves an elite force. Their ranks included future President George H.W. Bush, who served aboard the light carrier U.S. San Jacinto. These aviators had undergone rigorous training for up to 2 years under experienced combat veterans. They had practiced carrier takeoffs and landings, one of the most challenging tasks in naval aviation, using converted cruise liners as training carriers. Despite their lack of combat experience, they held a significant edge over their Japanese counterparts. The once feared Mitsubishi, a 6M0 fighter, was now inferior to the American F-6F Hellcat. The TBM Avenger torpedo bomber outperformed Japan's Nakajima B-6 in JIL, and the rugged SBD Dauntless dive bomber surpassed Japan's Yokosuka D-4 Ysuzi. As the Japanese fleet advanced, it immediately encountered trouble. American submarines targeted the First Mobile Fleet, sinking the destroyer and crippling 2 supply ships. In response, the Japanese sent their own submarines to scout the American fleet, but U.S. destroyers intercepted their communications and sank 17 of them. The destroyer escort U.S. England alone sank 6 Japanese submarines in just 13 days. While the invasion of Saipan continued, both Japanese and American reconnaissance planes searched the waters south of Iwo Jima for each other's fleets. Spruance, aboard his flagship U.S. Indianapolis, carefully considered his strategy. He suspected that Ozawa's true objective was to lure the Americans westward, allowing Japanese forces to strike at the amphibious invasion force off Saipan. Spruance knew that leaving the Marines unprotected could lead to disaster, as had nearly happened during the Guadalcanal campaign in 1942, when a premature American withdrawal had left ground forces in a vulnerable position. He decided to hold his fleet close to Saipan and wait for the Japanese to come to him, confident in his numerical and technological superiority. His strategy focused on using radar, superior fighter direction, and more advanced guns and aircraft to gain the upper hand. Spruance issued clear orders to his commanders. The first priority was to destroy enemy carriers, followed by attacks on battleships and cruisers. If the Japanese attempted to retreat, American forces were to pursue aggressively and ensure the destruction of the enemy fleet. Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher, who commanded the carrier forces, was not pleased with this defensive strategy. A veteran of carrier warfare, he and many of his officers wanted to strike first. On the other hand, Vice Admiral Willis Lee, in charge of the battleships, was ready for battle but had concerns about night engagements. From his past experience at Guadalcanal, he knew the Japanese excelled in nighttime combat. Additionally, many of his ships had inexperienced crews, making night maneuvers even riskier. He advised against seeking the night battle, though he was prepared to pursue any damage or retreating enemy ships. On the evening of June 18, American code breakers intercepted new orders from Ozawa to Japanese air bases in the Marianas. Direction-finding equipment located the first mobile fleet 355 miles west-southwest of Spruance's position. Mitcher proposed moving westward at 1:30 a.m. to position the fleet for a dawn attack. However, conflicting reports, including a submarine sighting that placed the Japanese further south and east, created uncertainty. After an hour of deliberation, Spruance decided against the plan, prioritizing the protection of the invasion forces. His decision frustrated some of his officers, but he remained firm in his approach. As the survivors arrived, they were highly disorganized. The attacks seemed endless, with aircraft constantly in sight and ships firing at them. Friendly planes stayed clear, so any aircraft within range was usually an enemy. The number of planes shot down or rounds fired was impossible to count in the chaos, but it was clear who had the upper hand. On American ships, sailors and officers in the combat information centers fought the battle by monitoring radar screens and listening to reports from fighter pilots, anti-aircraft gunners, and lookouts. They tracked incoming enemy planes on glassboards, using red grease pencils for Japanese aircraft and white for American ones. Identification systems helped distinguish friend from foe. Each time a radar operator called out new coordinates, trackers updated the data. As the Japanese planes closed in, fewer appeared on the radar, while American fighter pilots reported successful engagements. Not all news was good. One Japanese plane dropped a 551-pound bomb on South Dakota's forward superstructure, creating a large hole, damaging wiring and piping, and destroying the captain's and admiral's quarters. A 40mm anti-aircraft gun was knocked out, killing 27 crewmen and wounding 24 others. South Dakota's gunners claimed to have shot down the attacker, but Alabama's crew insisted the plane escaped, causing tensions between the ship's sailors. Lieutenant J.D. Frederick R. Stylitz, flying from the carrier, reported over the radio that he had shot down one plane and signaled that he had taken down another. However, he never returned to confirm his victories. With engine damage, he was forced to ditch in the ocean. He was seen climbing into his life raft but was never recovered. Despite these losses, the few Japanese aircraft that broke through did little damage. One bomber's payload landed near the cruiser Minneapolis, rupturing fuel and water lines and causing a fire. None of the enemy planes reached the carriers. By 10:57 a.m., radar screens were clear. The surviving attackers regrouped to return home, leaving only 8 fighters, 13 fighter bombers, and 6 torpedo bombers, just 27 of the original 69. The Americans lost 27 men on South Dakota and 4 pilots. Recognizing this was not the main assault, the American commander ordered his fighters to land, refuel, and rearm. While mechanics patched up the aircraft, pilots were debriefed over coffee. Meanwhile, torpedo and dive bombers circled, awaiting orders. Eventually, they were instructed to locate the Japanese fleet, with additional aircraft to follow once contact was made. Minutes later, the second wave of attacks began. The Japanese launched their second raid shortly after 8 a.m., consisting of 35 dive bombers, 27 torpedo bombers, and 48 fighters. As they passed over their own fleet, nervous anti-aircraft gunners mistakenly opened fire, shooting down 2 planes and damaging 8 more, forcing them to turn back. The formation was disorganized, reflecting the declining skill of their pilots. They flew at different speeds, breaking into smaller groups, and some lost contact with their leaders. One veteran pilot, Lieutenant Zenji Abe, who had fought at Pearl Harbor and Midway, was exhausted. He later described feeling as if someone else was flying his plane. As he continued, he noticed fewer aircraft in his formation, assuming they had turned back or crashed. When they reached the American fleet at 10:27, they were met by a dozen Hellcats from Essex, led by Commander David McCampbell, an Alabama-born pilot with a striking appearance. Before McCampbell and his men even engaged, the Japanese fleet faced another disaster. As the carrier Tahoe launched its planes, one pilot spotted a torpedo wake heading straight for the ship. In a desperate act of sacrifice, he banked his plane and crashed into the torpedo, saving the carrier from one hit. But 5 more torpedoes followed. The attack came from the submarine Albacore, commanded by Jim Blanchard. Ordered to intercept the Japanese fleet, Albacore spotted the carriers at 7:50 a.m. and prepared for an attack. Blanchard initially pursued one target, but then spotted Tahoe heading straight toward him. As the carrier moved into position, he ordered the torpedoes fired. One torpedo was stopped by the sacrificial pilot, but another struck near Tahoe's aviation fuel tanks, causing an explosion. The submarine dove deep to avoid retaliation as 2 Japanese destroyers began dropping depth charges. The explosions shook the submarine, but Blanchard kept his vessel steady and evaded further attacks. By noon, Albacore had escaped. Above, the damage to Tahoe seemed minor at first. The ship slowed slightly, and one of its elevators was jammed, but there were no immediate fires. However, unknown to the crew, fuel and oil lines had ruptured, leaking flammable vapors throughout the ship. The carrier continued sailing, with the fleet commander unaware of the growing danger. Meanwhile, the second wave of attackers pressed on toward the American carriers. At 11:17 a.m., Hellcats from Essex intercepted them. McCampbell and his squadron dived from 25,000 feet, spotting nearly 100 enemy aircraft. He led a side attack to scatter the formation, quickly downing 1 bomber. Many Japanese planes lacked self-sealing fuel tanks, making them highly vulnerable. McCampbell then targeted the formation leader and his wingman. He destroyed 1 wingman with a precise shot, then set the leader's plane ablaze. As his guns jammed, he pulled back to fix them before returning to the fight. By the time he was done, he had scored 5 confirmed kills and 1 probable. With his guns failing, he returned to Essex, now an ace. By the end of the war, he would have 34 victories, making him the Navy's top fighter pilot, later honored with a destroyer named after him. Essex's fighter squadron continued the battle, cutting through the remaining Japanese planes. As the survivors arrived, they were highly disorganized. The attacks seemed endless, with aircraft constantly in sight and ships in formation firing at them. American planes generally stayed clear, so any aircraft that got close was usually an enemy. The exact number of planes shot down or rounds fired was impossible to determine amid the chaos, but it was clear who had the upper hand. In the combat information centers of American ships, sailors and officers monitored radar screens, listening to reports from fighter pilots, anti-aircraft gunners, and lookouts. They tracked incoming enemy aircraft using red grease pencils for Japanese planes and white for American ones. U.S. planes were identifiable by their friend or foe identification system. As radar operators called out new bearings, the data was updated. As the battle continued, fewer enemy planes remained on the screens, while fighter pilots above gave more confident reports. Not all news was good. A Japanese plane struck South Dakota with a 551-pound bomb, blasting a hole in the ship and damaging wiring, piping, and the captain's and admiral's quarters. The explosion also destroyed a 40mm anti-aircraft gun, killing 27 crew members and wounding 24 more. South Dakota's gunners claimed they had shot down the attacker, but those on Alabama insisted the enemy plane escaped, fueling tensions between the crews. Lieutenant J.D. Frederick R. Stylitz, flying from the carrier, reported shooting down a plane and signaled another kill but never returned. With his engine damaged, he was forced to ditch in the ocean. He was seen climbing into a life raft but was never recovered. Despite these losses, the few Japanese planes that broke through caused little damage. One bomb exploded near the heavy cruiser Minneapolis, rupturing some fuel and water lines and starting a fire. Ultimately, none of the enemy aircraft reached the carriers. At 10:57 a.m., radar screens were clear. The surviving attackers regrouped to return home, with only 8 fighters, 13 fighter bombers, and 6 torpedo bombers left out of the original 69. The Americans lost 27 crew members on South Dakota and 4 pilots. Realizing this was not the main attack, American fighters rearmed and refueled. Mechanics patched damaged planes while pilots drank coffee and were debriefed. Meanwhile, torpedo and dive bombers circled, awaiting orders. Eventually, the Enterprise's torpedo bombers were sent to locate the Japanese fleet, with the rest of the air group to follow once contact was made. Minutes later, a second wave of attackers arrived. The Japanese force, consisting of 35 dive bombers, 27 torpedo bombers, and 48 fighters, launched shortly after 8:00 a.m. as they passed over a Japanese escort fleet. Nervous anti-aircraft gunners mistakenly opened fire, shooting down 2 planes and damaging 8 others, forcing them to turn back. The formation was disorganized, reflecting the declining skill of Japanese pilots. Aircraft flew at different speeds, with some losing contact with their leaders. Lieutenant T. Zenji Abe, a veteran of Pearl Harbor and Midway, struggled with exhaustion. He later described feeling as though someone else was flying his plane. As he continued on, he saw fewer aircraft in his formation, assuming they had either turned back or crashed due to confusion. At 10:27 a.m., he and his fellow pilots reached the American fleet, where a dozen Hellcats from Essex, led by Commander David McCampbell, intercepted them. Even before the American fighters attacked, the Japanese fleet faced disaster. As the carrier Tahoe launched its planes, one pilot noticed a torpedo streaking toward the ship. In a desperate act, he dived his aircraft into the torpedo's path, sacrificing himself to protect the carrier. Despite his efforts, more torpedoes followed. The attack came from the submarine Albacore, commanded by Jim Blanchard. Ordered to intercept the Japanese fleet, Albacore spotted the enemy at 7:50 a.m. and prepared for an attack. Blanchard maneuvered into position and fired 6 torpedoes. One was intercepted by the Japanese pilot's heroic sacrifice, but another struck near Tahoe's aviation fuel tanks, triggering an explosion. Japanese destroyers immediately counterattacked, dropping depth charges. Albacore evaded destruction by diving deep and escaping by noon. Above, Tahoe initially appeared to have survived with only minor damage, but the explosion had ruptured fuel and oil lines. Unaware of the growing danger, the crew continued sailing. Meanwhile, the second wave of attackers continued toward the American fleet. At 11:17 a.m., radar detected nearly 100 enemy planes, prompting the Hellcats from Essex to engage. McCampbell and his pilots dove from 25,000 feet, striking fast to scatter the enemy. His guns set one dive bomber ablaze, sending it crashing. He then destroyed another plane and targeted the formation leader, eliminating 2 wingmen before taking out the leader himself. McCampbell's guns jammed temporarily, forcing him to reset before re-entering the fight. Despite the overwhelming firepower of the Hellcats, the surviving Japanese pilots pressed on with determination. He spotted another enemy leader and fired, causing the plane to crash. By the end of the battle, he had 5 confirmed kills and 1 probable, making him an ace. He would go on to achieve 34 aerial victories, becoming the Navy's top fighter pilot, with his name later honored on a destroyer. As the battle raged, Essex's fighter squadron continued tearing through the Japanese attackers. Despite suffering injuries, N9G Power managed to land on Essex with 150 holes in his plane. Help arrived as the rest of the carrier planes, led by Vasu, charged in. With his windshield cleared, Vasu shot down a Judy from close range and quickly targeted 2 more ahead. He positioned himself behind them and opened fire. The right-hand Judy's rear gunner fired back, but Vasu's 6 machine guns proved overwhelming. The Judy released a puff of smoke, which turned into a black stream before crashing into the sea, its gunner still firing. Wasting no time, Vasu fired short bursts at the second Judy, causing it to fall out of control and into the ocean. In just 3 minutes, he had taken down 3 planes. Spotting a 4th Judy breaking formation, Vasu fired a long burst, setting it ablaze and sending it plummeting from the sky. He then noticed 3 more Judys approaching their dive bombing points and crept up on the rear one. Once within range, he squeezed the trigger, and his bullets disintegrated the target. Moving swiftly, he fired on the lead Judy of the trio, which exploded in a bright flash, likely from its bomb detonating. Pulling up sharply to avoid debris, Vasu radioed, "Splash number 6." Finding no more enemy planes nearby, he returned to Lexington for fuel and ammunition. As he taxied onto the deck, he noticed Admiral Mitscher watching him from the flag bridge. Grinning, Vasu climbed out of his cockpit and held up 6 fingers to signal his victories, achieved with only 360 rounds of ammunition. After parking, he was greeted by a group of well-wishers led by the Admiral himself, who requested a photograph for his personal records. With 18 kills to his name, Vasu secured 1 more the following day and later received the Navy Cross for his bravery. The photo taken of him became a symbol of victory in American newspapers. The Lexington's aviators claimed multiple enemy aircraft, including Jills, Judys, Kates, and Zeros, without suffering any losses. The Bunker Hill pilots had fewer victories, but another squadron downed additional aircraft. The sheer number of enemy planes shot down led one observer to compare the battle to a turkey shoot, giving rise to the name, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Meanwhile, Japanese pilot Zenji Abe pressed forward toward the American fleet. Despite losing his wingman and being pursued by Hellcats, he aimed for a proper dive-bombing attack on Wast. His bomb missed but detonated nearby, injuring 2 men and causing minor damage. Miraculously, he survived both American flak and fighter attacks, becoming the only Japanese pilot to drop a bomb on a carrier that day and return home safely. 2 more Judy bombers targeted Wast, initially mistaken for friendly aircraft. Once their true intentions were clear, the carrier's guns opened fire. 1 bomb landed off the port beam, killing 1 man and injuring several others. The gunners retaliated, shooting down the attacking plane. Further out, 4 Japanese torpedo planes attempted runs on Enterprise and Princeton, but were swiftly destroyed by anti-aircraft fire. 1 American officer noted the sheer volume of enemy planes being shot down, describing the scene as a series of brilliant red fireballs and thick plumes of smoke against the sky. Dogfights raged, with American pilots diving from high altitudes to engage the enemy. Lieutenant Ra Cheyenne Jr. led his division into a chaotic battle, managing to down an enemy plane in a high-speed maneuver. Lieutenant J.J. Geo Staley spotted a Judy in a dive and took it down with precise shots. Despite the overwhelming American defense, some Japanese bombers managed to break through. Several targeted the destroyer Stockham, attacking from multiple directions for nearly 20 minutes. However, they failed to land a single hit as American gunners systematically picked them off. Lieutenant William Lamb, flying over Stockham, found himself among a formation of enemy bombers. With only 1 functioning gun, He called for reinforcements before personally shooting down 3 planes. Enterprise pilots finally had their moment, with 2 aviators intercepting a Judy on its dive toward a battleship, setting it ablaze. Another group spotted torpedo bombers lining up their attacks and prevented one from launching its payload. The battleships endured waves of attacks but sustained little damage. South Dakota faced repeated torpedo runs, while Alabama and Indiana countered their attackers, shooting down multiple enemy planes. One Jill struck Indiana, but caused minimal harm before sinking. As Japanese planes moved past the battleships and toward the carriers, they faced another wave of American fire. A Judy attempting to attack Enterprise was shot down before it could drop its bomb. Another Jill was destroyed before reaching Princeton, and a third launched its torpedo just before being obliterated, missing its target. Bunker Hill lookouts spotted 2 more Judys emerging from a cloud bank. One was torn apart midair, while the other managed to drop a bomb near the carrier's elevator, causing fires and casualties but failing to cripple the ship. By 12:15 p.m., American radar showed no more enemy aircraft in the vicinity. The surviving Japanese pilots, including Abe, regrouped for the return journey. Out of the 128 planes Ozawa had sent, only 31 made it back. The waters around the American fleet were filled with burning wreckage and the shattered hopes of the Japanese forces. Despite the heavy losses, Ozawa remained determined. His fleet awaited further reports as another American submarine, Kavala, moved into position. Commanded by veteran submariner Herman Kostler, Kavala had been ordered to intercept enemy vessels. After evading detection the previous night, Kostler spotted a Japanese carrier through his periscope. Identifying it as Shokaku, he positioned for an attack. As an enemy destroyer turned toward him, Kostler fired 5 torpedoes before diving. Within moments, 3 direct hits rocked Shokaku. Kavala maneuvered through an intense depth charge attack that lasted for hours. Though the submarine sustained leaks, it managed to escape. Above, Shokaku struggled to contain fires and explosions. Efforts to save the carrier failed, and at 3:00 p.m., an explosion from an ammunition magazine tore through the ship. She sank, taking over 1,200 crew members with her. Kavala's crew, listening from below, reported the sinking. Vice Admiral Charles Lockwood in Hawaii received the message and responded with praise, acknowledging that 1 carrier was down, with 8 more to go. Despite the devastating losses, Ozawa was not ready to concede. The battle was far from over, and while Spruance had effectively defended his fleet, he had yet to launch a full-scale counterattack against the remaining Japanese forces.